Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started again on our afternoon sessions here. And for those returning in our web-based audience, welcome back. So our first subject is going to be produce safety, but for those on the processing side. So what do we need to be aware of? What do we need to be thinking about as processors in terms of managing our suppliers upstream, and just some of the basics around the regulation that you need to be aware of. So some of the slides, if you were here this morning, you're going to see some of the same slides, but definitely we'll be talking kind of from a different angle and getting you guys kind of familiar with what you need to be aware of there. I think we've been getting a lot of questions on this, and that's part of why we wanted to include it in the agenda today. Is a lot of folks on the processing side are not as well aware of what's in the regulation or how to handle it in terms of managing their suppliers. So, and part of the, it's not tabbing for me, Tommy. Part of the requirement in supply chain for preventive controls is to make sure that your suppliers are meeting the regulations. All right, and so this first slide is just an old comic that I had in my folder, and it's outdated now because you see the guy sitting there. He's reading the paper, and it's got a pistachio warning, a red meat warning, and a peanut warning. So it got all these recalls for food safety. And he's thinking, why can't it ever be Brussels sprouts? And of course, now with the recent recalls that we've seen with produce, we're starting to see that, you know what, it can, right? And it's happening in places that we didn't always expect it to occur, or we're seeing new types of reasons for recalls. And I think, suffice to say, it's safe to say you can't really assume anything, and you've got to build in due diligence when it comes to food safety. So the approach I took with this is, as you manage your suppliers upstream, you've got to be thinking about the nature of risk for your products, right? And based on risk, you tailor your program. So with food safety, we always say it is risk-based, right? And so if you've got a higher risk product, and some examples of factors that could be included in that is if there is minimal processing of your product to reduce microbes. So if it's something that's eaten fresh, right? If it's something that's not heat treated or anything like that, that's a higher risk item. Things that are imported from other countries, there are some challenges depending on where it's imported from in terms of food safety. There are some areas in the world that export a lot of produce to the U.S., and some of them may not have the same level of food safety standards that we do here. So, whoa, what happened? Okay, so with higher risk products, full compliance with the regulation should be verified, in my mind. If you got something that's eaten fresh, you really should be doing some due diligence, getting a food safety audit from them, or visiting them yourself, or doing something to make sure that you understand, you know, what are you doing around water? What are you doing for employee hygiene practices? What have you got in place in terms of cleaning and sanitation, right? So all these things they're built into the produce safety rule, we need to be going into detail to understand what they're doing, and considering additional requirements like good agricultural practices programs, because again, as we said this morning, for those of you that were here, in many cases, this regulation and others are kind of setting a foundational minimum standard, but there's a lot more that you could be doing in some cases to minimize risk, and should be doing really if the risk is high. So good agricultural practices programs overlap quite a bit with the regulation, but there are some differences, and there are some additional requirements that are more specific in GAP programs that aren't in the regulation a requirement. And there are also some specific requirements under the regulation that aren't in most GAP programs, like the water testing, right? So for lower risk items, and you can see we got a picture of some trees there. I think they're pistachios, and lower risk items are things that are off the ground, right? If you contrast a tree fruit or a tree nut to leafy greens or baby carrots or something like that, you can see there's such a contrast in terms of risk between the two. And so things that I would consider, you know, lower risk are off the ground, things where There's been no history of grower-related recalls. If there have been recalls with this commodity or type of commodity, it's been more due to process contamination at the facility that's processing it and packaging it. If there are items where later processing reduces risk, I would consider that lower risk. So things that are pasteurized. Many tree nuts are pasteurized. Tomato products that are made into canned tomatoes or paste or something like that are common items in California that I would consider maybe lower risk. Doesn't mean no risk, right? We still got to do the right things, right? We had a discussion earlier about log reductions and the fact that most pasteurizations are a 5-log reduction, right? And fecal matter typically has maybe 11 log or 12 log bacteria in it. So you take 11 and you subtract 5, you've still got a 6-log contamination in the product. So you still got to be careful and do the right things. But later processing can reduce risk. And also, I would say, as you can see on the slide, in many cases, if it's domestic product, then it's going to be lower risk in my mind than some imported items. Or if it is imported, but it's a product where you have robust oversight, maybe it's controlled within the same company. The same company owns the farming over there, or a sister company, and you have direct access. You've walked the growing operation. You know what their practices are, right? So it's always a specific analysis that you do for your company and for your products, right? There's no easy answer or single solution where you say all of these are always high risk and all of these are always low risk. Right? It really is a complex scenario. So contamination sources, I like to say that this slide is kind of a roadmap that kind of explains the produce safety rule, that regulation, as well as the training associated with it, where it kind of lays out, we've got our produce in the center of the slide, and all the potential sources of contamination that can get into that produce. The rule is built around things like controls on water, controls on people, whether employees or visitors, controls on equipment and facilities, animal controls, so all those different things, even soil amendments, right? Those are all things that we can control under the produce safety rule to help minimize risk, right? Minimize risk for those products that we're receiving. So again, as I emphasized this morning, I don't think anybody expects produce to come in from the field sterile, right? But what we want to do is focus on practices that significantly reduce risk in those finished products, so that if there is anything there, it's less of a risk and maybe easier to remove during processing, or maybe it's not a pathogenic strain of bacteria, things like that. So lower risk, basically. So again, getting into some of the details of what can go wrong with produce safety, and why am I doing this? I'm doing this because as processors who are qualifying your suppliers, you need to know what to look for. You need to know what to ask, don't you? Right? And of course, if you want further details on the produce safety rule, we do have the one-day training that we do, the official training that's approved by FDA. And it's managed very similar to the PCQI training, if any of you have taken that, in that it's got an official certificate and all of that. So, but what we look for with people is the different contamination sources, things like clothing, hands, right? When people are working sick or they get an illness, these are all things that we think of in terms of GMPs and employee hygiene in the processing environment that aren't necessarily always discussed in great detail in harvest crews and things like that as much as they could be, right? Maybe we're not as conscious of it. I've been to places where I've seen somebody use the restroom, come out of the porta potty and not wash their hands. I shared that this morning, right? That they didn't wash their hands and they went back to handling product. And that's just the kind of thing that we really need to prevent happening. And we don't always think about clothing or footwear or things like that. But again, if somebody has animals at their house that they're dealing with, that they're tending to in the morning before they come to work, right? That we should be making sure that as growers that we have that conversation with our employees and talk to them about it, so they understand that they need to maybe wear different shoes to work than what they wore in the animal pen, because you just can't police that on your own, right? As a grower. So as processors, then you should be looking at those sorts of things. What do you have around employee hygiene programs, right? What are you doing in terms of that? And so these are kind of a breakdown of the requirements, kind of a high-level summary in terms of people on the farm, right? So establish practices, what we call good agricultural practices or employee hygiene practices, establish them, make sure everybody is trained. Right? So we have this structure where, similar to what we see on the processing side, all employees need to receive some sort of generic training about food safety and hygiene. And then we also expect to see additional training related to their job if they have a specialized task they're doing, like harvesting or washing containers, running equipment. They should be qualified for that task through training as well. Right? Then we expect to see visitor communication, right? Both to employees about how to deal with visitors and with visitors when they come around our policies and what they should be aware of. We should be providing restrooms for our employees and visitors, as well as adequate hand washing. And when we talk about hand washing, we get into provision of clean water, not necessarily warm like we would require, because that's just not logistically feasible, but at least to provide water that's clean for washing hands. And soap, and some sort of adequate hand drying. We got into a discussion a little bit about that this morning and what are some good options for hand drying. But typically, bottom line, we would look for single-use paper towels as the best option. But definitely a requirement to make sure we have that buttoned up. And then, as I mentioned, qualification of your workers and just providing adequate facilities in general for restrooms, for break areas, any of these sorts of things. So contamination can definitely come from soil amendments. So raw animal products are a key source of contamination, whether it's manure or bone meal or anything like that, that can be a source of contamination. The way they're handled, the tools that we use, right? Tools can cross-contaminate if we use it for soil amendment and then later we're using it to scoop or rake product. Anything like that, right? We need to be aware of. And by the way, I'm just going to pause for a second and reiterate, just like we said this morning, I want to open up the floor for questions. All right. I definitely, it's always better when we're interactive. It's always better when you guys say, hey, what about this? I have a question. So please stop me if you want to ask anything. So, but even the way soil amendments are stored, there can be wind spread or runoff. So what do we look for in terms of controls, right? The regulatory requirements, we should be looking for any treated amendments to go through a controlled process, right? So composted, treated in some way under temperature and time controls that are validated to reduce risk. When we do the one-day training, we get into the details around what temperatures and what times we're looking for and some different options. But suffice to say, they should know what they're doing in terms of reducing risk by hitting those targets. If you're going to be doing any treatments on site yourself, composting on the farm, you need to hit the same time and temperature targets. The way you store animal products, as you can see on the second bullet point, for soil amendments, the way you store those products and the way they're handled, definitely some key requirements there to minimize risk is the bottom line. So really the responsibility of the farmer is to minimize risk there, and then ultimately to maintain records. So I always draw the comparison between, in California, we're so familiar with keeping records of pesticide application, and we should be doing something kind of similar to that with soil amendments, because we look at things like, if you applied a raw soil amendment, what is the time interval between when you applied it and when you harvest? That's a key factor. You should be leaving enough time between the two so the risk of contamination is minimal, right? Things like that. Or what did I apply and when and where and who did I get it from? So just keeping those records, kind of similar to what we would do for pesticides. So for animals, this is a little bit of a contentious subject here, right? Because there's only so much you can do. You're not going to build a dome over the farm. So, we've got wild animals and domesticated. And we can do some things around domesticated animals for certain to, keep our dog in the truck, try to limit animals that are around. Mike had a great session that he did this morning around some specifics on animal controls. And I believe we're going to make that available, work on making that available after today as a recording. But again, suffice to say that we need to be kind of just surveying and making sure that we're minimizing any risk from wild or domesticated animals as much as we can. So as far as regulatory requirements, what they're looking for is during the growing season, monitoring for activity as appropriate. Now, that's kind of a key thing there, as appropriate, right? So if we're growing something that is in the ground or directly on the ground as the edible portion of the crop, so something again like carrots or leafy greens, berries, things like that, that are more likely to get contaminated when there's an animal around. It's going to be, higher risk, and maybe we need to monitor those areas more often. When it's something like a tree crop or, grapevines or something like that, maybe the risk is a bit lower and maybe there's less surveying that we need to do during the season. But as it gets close to harvest, who do we train to look for animal activity and minimize risk, right? How are they trained, and do they keep any records of any issues that come up? And that's going to be a new one for a lot of us, right, is keeping records when we see animal activity, because a lot of growers don't typically do that. So, but that'll be an interesting one. And so these are things, again, as a processor to look for, controlling domesticated animals based on risk. And again, around animals, training your employees, applying some corrective actions when something goes wrong, and keeping records of those things. Again, some of the corrective actions, as we looked at Mike's slides this morning, right? I mean, there's a couple examples of feces on leafy greens, the edible product. So certainly a corrective action around that. Or if you see nibbling or gnawing, eating on the edges of the field, certainly there's an appropriate action we can take with that. Maybe we give a 5 or 10 foot buffer of product that we don't harvest on the edge of the field. So these are all options that are going to look different for different industries and different products. And maybe, I know some of you in here grow a variety of products or process a variety of products, and maybe the programs will look the same for all of them. Maybe they'll look a little different depending on what it is. Right? I mean, even time of year, right? He was mentioning the animals tend to shed E. coli more during the summer. And I know citrus, for instance, is harvested in the winter, right? Typically, a lot of them are. I know some are summer, but a lot of them are winter. So around water, we have some key requirements here. There's a whole lot to get into here, so I won't get into it in great detail, but sampling and testing those water sources that are covered by the regulation. Anything that is intended to or likely to contact the product is going to be considered a covered water application. So we're getting into foliar sprays, right? Crop sprays. We're getting into irrigation for anything that is touching the ground, or we're getting into things like sprinklers that are touching the trees if it's a tree crop and they're spraying the trees. Additionally, I would argue too, what you're using to clean your equipment. Are you cleaning your harvest equipment? Are you cleaning the processing equipment with anything? And the water that you use, I would argue, is also covered. All right, so this kind of gets into, as I was just discussing, when you're trying to determine if the water you're using is covered. Is the crop covered, first of all? If it's a crop that falls under the regulation, definitely need to consider that water source. And the second piece is if it's a covered activity. If you got those two pieces in place, then the water is agricultural water. It's definitely covered. Be strategic with your water sources as a grower, though. Right? So as a processor, you can talk to them about what water sources do you use where. If you've got a lower risk water source like groundwater versus surface, you can target using that groundwater in applications like crop sprays instead of the surface water if possible. So requirements in general for water, the water overall must be safe and of adequate sanitary quality for any kind of agricultural operation. So in the field, this means we meet the standards for this microbial water quality profile, where we're doing ongoing testing. We keep a history of our test results, and we get a calculation of what our water quality is, right? There's a numeric calculation, and we just have to assess whether or not we meet the numbers that FDA has given us. When it comes to post-harvest, like a packing operation, then we don't have a threshold for how much generic E. coli is okay. All right, there's no generic E. coli allowed in a 100 ml sample. So the indicator we use, again, Tom went into this morning, but the indicator we use for this is generic E. coli. That's an indicator of the quality of the water, because this is a good indicator of fecal contamination. If there's a lot of generic E. coli in there, chances are we might also see salmonella, or we might see parasites or viruses in there that could hurt people. So that's why they chose that indicator. So we need to inspect distribution systems. So ask your growers what they do to inspect their piping and their sprinklers and things. It should happen at least once a year or whenever they need to based on risk. And we're looking for an appropriate response to any unusual events like natural flooding, or somebody left the pump running overnight and now the fields are flooded with this water that we don't normally use in contact with the crop, but it's flooded and it's touched the crop, the edible portion of it. All right, so some of the things to look for. Then we get into surfaces and equipment and buildings. Again, we're just looking for cleanliness here and well-maintained, right? Because otherwise we can get bacterial contamination, we can get foreign materials falling into products, we can get things like oils and greases and hydraulic fluids if equipment is not maintained that can all be a bad source of contamination that we want to avoid for our consumers. So, so what we're looking at in terms of requirements for this section is, again, adequate cleanliness of the equipment, of the general area. There are things we look for commonly in these environments, things like, is there standing water? If standing water is around for too long, then definitely there's a potential for pathogens to grow. This is why we often swab drains. Maybe you've heard that, right? Maybe you've done it yourself. We swab drains to assess for pathogens, right? Because that's where they tend to collect. There's moisture there. And also when we wash all the equipment, it goes down into that drain. So if it's in the drain, we've got to figure out whether or not it's elsewhere in the plant. Some plants don't have drains, right? And in that case, you just basically apply whatever makes sense for your facility in terms of program. Appropriate equipment design, looking at packaging materials and vehicles for suitability and for cleanliness, because what we put the product in, the vehicle that we use to transport it, can be a source of contamination. And we've seen some changes, haven't we, in the vehicles used for produce. We're starting to see more covers. We're starting to see curtains on the sides of vehicles to close them in. Some new and different things that we're seeing now on this end. So, and then pest management programs, right? And whether this means baits outside, tin cats in the facility, whatever it means, depending on the operation. Right, so in terms of options for processors for compliance with your regulation as you deal with your growers, your suppliers. So for high risk items, I would be looking for evidence of compliance with some sort of GAP program, including FSMA, right? So not just the GAP program, but also FSMA requirements. So we've seen a lot of these GAP programs discussing adding on FSMA requirements into their program, integrating it in. I know we've seen that on the processor side where we have a supplemental checklist for FSMA for preventive controls, right? So you may want to look at what sort of GAP programs they have and are they complying or not. When we look at things like leafy greens or carrots, even citrus or avocados or cherries, a lot of these industries already have GAP programs in place based on customer expectations, which is always higher than regulations, right? We have the regulatory requirement, then we have what the customer expects, and that's what we see here. So aside from having that sort of an audit from them, another option might be an on-site visit, which may not be practical depending on how many growers you have, right? But on-site visits may be an option for verifying their compliance with the rule. For lower risk products, right, some options there might be maybe they don't do a GAP audit right now, right? So if you're in an industry where they're not doing that and it's a lower risk product and there's just not a history of that in the past, you might send them a questionnaire. Right, so growers might expect to see a questionnaire that they need to fill out to meet those requirements. So the processor understands, hey, here's 10 or 12 questions that I need to answer so that my processor understands what my systems look like and what I'm doing as far as controls to meet the regulation. Or rather than sending them a questionnaire, you might want to go visit them and fill out the questionnaire on site with them, or give them a call over the phone and talk through the questionnaire with them. Right, so this is something that maybe the grower representatives for the company can do, is reach out to them, to each grower individually, and just talk through what you're doing, what they are doing to reduce risk and to comply with the regulation. Right, because again, part of our responsibility under the preventive controls rule is to make sure our suppliers meet regulations. And then ultimately just getting some sort of a confirmation from them that they are compliant. What I'm thinking of here is I wouldn't recommend just getting a letter of guarantee from a grower per se. That's not a recommendation, but I do know that in some arenas in the food industry, when we think about things like food packaging is typically considered pretty low risk, right? As long as you're buying it from a reputable supplier. So we'll often see that a food processor, when they're qualifying a food packaging supplier, might just get a letter of guarantee from them explaining how that they comply with XYZ regulation as it applies to them, and maybe a simple audit like a GMP audit of the facility to make sure their facility is clean. So something equivalent to that for the grower might be something to consider as well. Some sort of a little inspection and documentation around what they're doing to comply. But regardless, again, at the end of the day, we need to do something to make sure that we understand that they're complying and what they're doing to do that. So there is an exemption for commercial processing. So some of the examples I gave earlier were almonds and some other tree nuts that are pasteurized, as well as tomatoes that are commercially processed. And both are common crops in California, which is why I choose those examples. So if the processor has a kill step in place, now that's not a regulatory term, right? So you talk to the FDA about a kill step, they may not like that term necessarily very much, but that's kind of a common term we use in the industry, which is why I use it.
Benchmark for that? Maybe 5 log, 6 log, 7 log, is that the benchmark?
So the primary guideline is the 5 log reduction. Now I know that it gets a little different sometimes for certain industries. I think for milk, maybe it's a 6 log. Canned foods, there's a higher expectation there because they expect commercial sterility.
But for lower risk item, 5 log reduction.
That's the standard usually.
Would be considered in the trade of those steps?
Yes, so in the trade, a 5 log reduction, yes, would be considered a kill step, quote unquote, right? That's what we would be talking about. So for products that go through a process that significantly reduces any microbes of public health concern, that's kind of the language you'll see with FDA. What we look for is if you get certain documents in place, and I'll explain that on this slide, then you can take the exemption and the grower doesn't have to comply with the regulation. So the way this works is, first off, the grower lets the processor know, whether it's in their contract, in documentation, with the load, and really FDA is looking for documentation that accompanies the physical product. So to be honest, you're looking at shipping documentation or something stated on the label or something like that, telling the processor when they receive it, hey, this is not processed to reduce the risk of microbes. Okay, something along those lines. And there is a specific phrase that they have in the regulation. All right, it does get into certain language, but something similar to that language is probably adequate. So that's the first thing, is let the processor know, hey, this is not processed to reduce risk. So then the processor then sends documentation back to the grower that basically states, yeah, I understand this and I agree, I'm going to put it through a process step that significantly reduces these microbes. It's going to get pasteurized, it's going to get canned, or whatever the case may be. So in this scenario, growers can take an exemption from the regulation. All right. Doesn't mean you should take a complete exemption, right? We need to be doing our due diligence as growers. And so you as processors, should be looking at your suppliers and going, well, are they applying raw manure like a month before harvest or anything like that, right? That's something that's just obviously a no-no. And so there should be some basic requirements in place. Even if they don't meet the full regulation, they should still be doing some things to meet at least most of it in my mind. All right. But this second part, the agreement that you communicate back to the grower, this guarantee statement is delayed. So there is an enforcement discretion that FDA put out. This is a process they go through with some regulations where they basically say, okay, we've got this regulation out, but we're going to take this one piece out and we're going to say, you know what, this is going to be hard to comply with right now. So we're going to set this aside for 2 years, or we're going to set it aside until further notice. And you don't have to really comply with it right now. So that second piece for this exemption does not yet have to be complied with. You don't have to get that guarantee back from the processor as a grower yet. Now, there are companies that are doing it now. They're already communicating that, but it's not required yet legally. Now, I see some confused looks. So I want some questions. What are you guys curious about here? Does this make sense? Yes.
So on the tomato side, so I have to get, if I get letters from all of my growers, all 15 growers,
right,
that they're telling me, which is kind of a known fact, that it's not a process.
Yes.
Fruit, right? in the field. I just respond back to them with a letter saying, yeah, I'm totally aware of it. We're gonna cook it, and so you're off the hook.
Yes, that's how it works basically. So the question is, so as a tomato processor, right, if you get communication from them, hey, this is raw, which you already know, and then you respond to them with a documentation stating, yes, I'm totally aware of it. I'm going to process it. It's going through a heat treatment. Then the growers can take the exemption. A yes. Yes. So as a processor, then, you know, you might win some friends with that one on the grower side, right? Where they don't have to follow the regulation because you're giving them the document they need.
Well, one question that, I mean, I understand the difference with the grower and the processor piece, but staying with the tomato side, that all of those trucks have to be transported from the field, which can be hours away.
Mm-hmm.
How are we maintaining compliance with regards to maintaining the unadulteratedness of the crop itself? How can I prove that from point A to point B, no adulteration took place?
Yeah. So the question is, how can I prove, for instance, with the trucks that are coming from the field in these open trucks, or tomatoes coming in from the field in these open trucks, how can I prove that they're not adulterated? Right. And that's a good question. And FDA might ask some questions around what controls do you have on those tomatoes, right? And so, but typically from what I've seen, there's not a lot of stopping going on with that traffic. It's typically pretty direct, back and forth to the same field till it's empty, right? And then you've got documentation and you know who the driver is. So all these things that we normally would do under SQF or BRC or other programs to control those, I feel for now would be adequate largely, unless there's some other risk factor where they're stopping over somewhere. But again, as I said, for some crops, they've started enclosing, right? They've got curtains on the trucks and things to further secure them because they assessed and determined that there is a risk there, right? So that may be something that eventually we go to closed containment for those sorts of crops, because it really is a good question. It's fair because it's always evolving, right? What was good enough 10 years ago is not good enough today, is it? Right? So that's a fair question. So we have a question from the online audience.
What if the processor owns the growing process? Would this agreement?
What if the processor owns the growing process? Would this agreement still be needed, right? So, well, I think FDA looks at it in terms of ownership, but also in terms of company names. And if they're two separate companies, I would expect to see something like this between them, even if it's the same person or entity. But if they're the same company and they're vertically integrated, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess that would be something that, they would expect to see us doing the right thing, right? And having controls in place to make sure that things are not contaminated. And this is the thing, especially as we get into the growing side, under the processing environment, there's a lot of similarity. There's a lot of parallels with most processors, and it varies by industry. But as you get into the growing side, it's so much more diverse. And there's so many little scenarios of different companies, whether they're vertically integrated or this group and that group, or the processor is a co-op. So all the growers own the co-op and they own the company, where there's a lot of complexities there that there's not necessarily a one sentence answer for, right? And so it's just a matter of figuring out what makes sense. But again, as we said earlier, the FDA does have a technical assistance network on their website where you can go in and ask them these questions, and they may already have an answer. If not, their experts will look for one and give it to you. And I would be happy to dialogue with you offline on any of these questions too, and even ask a question on your behalf, because I've had customers that have asked me, can you ask FDA this question for me, right? Because I don't want to be the one to ask it. And I don't mind doing that too. So we had a question over here.
Just a comment, if you were completely vertically integrated, that's all the internal documents.
Right.
So you would know.
And that's a great point. If you were completely vertically integrated, you would already have all those documents anyway to show FDA. And so you probably would have it covered. Yeah. Whereas as a processor buying from growers that we're not vertically integrated with, right? It's our due diligence to make sure we understand what they're doing. As you said, we already know what they're doing because it's us. That's a good point. Thank you. All right. So are there any further questions on that subject? Preventive or produce safety for preventive controls folks, for the processors? Any questions online or anything? Okay, so So I think we're at our cutover time for the preventive controls section. So in this next section, we're going to be covering the preventive controls rule, but not just what you've already heard in the past in the PCQI training or something like this. What we wanted to try to do, with all these sessions today is build a little bit more depth into what you've already learned. So hopefully some of what we talk about now will be new to you. So I'm going to spend a little time kind of summarizing the rule and maybe some gaps with the rule itself that we see a lot with processors. And then some things we've heard from the industry in terms of things that FDA is pointing out or finding that they want to see us do better on. But again, I mean, anybody here that's been through an inspection in the last year or two that fell under FSMA and you have some learnings that you want to share, I mean, you're more than welcome to make any comments as far as, hey, when FDA came, they were looking at this and they gave us a hard time on it, or they were happy with the way we handled this. You're more than welcome to share those with us as well. So one of the things with preventive controls, there's a hazard analysis element like HACCP, isn't there, right? So similar to HACCP, we're required to identify any known or reasonably foreseeable hazards. Right, so a known or reasonably foreseeable hazard is something that maybe there's been a recall in the past in our industry for. Or we've got a positive hit on a lab test in the past, right, on our product, on our swabs in our facility. Say we found Listeria in a drain a couple of times in our facility. Well, that should be in our hazard analysis, shouldn't it? Right, we should be saying, okay, Listeria is a hazard for my products. Here's how I'm controlling it. Maybe it's a CCP, maybe it's just preventive control or prerequisite programs like sanitation, swabbing. But it's assessing those risks and determining what we need to do to control them. This is based on severity and likelihood for HACCP and for preventive controls. And so severity, I mean, when we're talking about severity, a hazard might be a severity of something like a chipped tooth from a rock, right? Which we don't want to see that happen, right? But as compared to some strains of Salmonella or E. coli, which we could see hundreds of deaths, there's a little difference in severity there, right? So part of our job is to assess the severity of the hazard as well as the likelihood, right? The likelihood is, it gets back to, well, is it something that would never occur, it'd be impossible, or is it something that occurs all the time and we really need to do something about it? Or is it in that area of, usually CCPs are there to control those risks that maybe occur once in a while and they're a really significant risk, and we've got to have that one process to make sure that we eliminate that small risk because it could be a really big deal for us. All right, so we're looking at that whole severity versus likelihood formula in terms of any hazards that are naturally occurring coming in on the product or accidentally occur or intentional. Right, so intentional contamination definitely is something that we need to be worried about. And that gets more into, as far as FSMA, the intentional adulteration rule that we'll talk about later today, right? But for preventive controls, we're looking at intentional adulteration upstream. This is one that I've seen gaps on. As processors, we don't always have a really good assessment of what could happen upstream and how we're controlling it. So you see in SQF and BRC, all these GFSI programs, that they have a higher expectation now of intentional adulteration assessment and programs around that. And that's why, because we see things like, for instance, there was some cumin. It's a spice, right? We've all used it. We've seen it in chili. We've seen it in barbecue sauce, whatever. Cumin. There was a bunch of cumin that had peanut protein in it. You guys remember this one? And so they're recalling cumin off the shelf. They're recalling barbecue sauce, dry rubs, frozen meals, all kinds of stuff, right, that have this cumin in them, whatever products were affected. Kind of a cascade effect of all these recalls. And, for many, many hundreds of years, people have put other stuff into spices before they grind them because spices are expensive and you can make money by doing this. You're cheating, right? You're cheating the customer to make money. In this case, this individual or this company cheated the customer by putting some peanut shells they had lying around into the cumin before they ground it. Right? So the peanut shells had peanut protein. People had allergic responses. Boom, we've got a problem. And the sad thing is, if they had chosen something innocuous like wood fiber or something else, it wouldn't have gotten caught, right? So today there's spices out there on the shelf right now with other stuff in them, right, besides the spice. So it goes back to managing your supply chain. And then what's new under FSMA, under preventive controls, is economically motivated adulteration, as I just talked about, is emphasized more in the supply chain. Radiological hazards. So what risk is there of radiological contamination, right? And where did this come from? Well, in 2011, they signed FSMA into law. Around that time, we had something going on in Japan, didn't we? Do you guys remember? Yeah.
Fukushima.
Yeah, Fukushima Daiichi, right? Yeah, we had the meltdown, right? Is that what you said over there? Yeah. So we're starting to find these, these contamination events in different food, maybe fish, things like that. And people are starting to ask the question, how do I know my food is safe? So I think for most processors, there's not going to be much there as far as radiological hazard risk for your products. But part of your due diligence is to make sure you're doing that assessment, right? So it should probably make an appearance in your hazard analysis, and you should say, yes, there's a risk, and here's how I'm controlling it, or no, there's no risk, right? It's minimal risk. And then finally, environmental hazards for any exposed ready-to-eat products. Anything that's ready to eat and it gets exposed to the environment, we have to assess for environmental hazards. We should be swabbing, we should be sampling products. If we have ready-to-eat products that are not exposed to the environment, well, that kind of comes into a judgment call, right? We probably still should be doing something for swabbing and inspecting and sampling of our products, but it's required specifically that we do those sorts of things if it's ready to eat and exposed.
You have a lot of that, in the produce rule. Peaches, plums, and nectarines, apples, pears are all considered ready to eat, even though they're packed in the house or packed in the house.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, a lot of produce is ready to eat as is. It comes off the tree, it gets washed, and it's ready to eat.
No, it doesn't even get washed. The government.
That's true.
We've been told that the government, if they wouldn't expect, if they could eat it as is in the store, should wash, but are not required to, or there's the opportunity that somebody would just eat it as is considered ready to eat.
Yeah.
So tree fruit, grapes, even if they're totally unwashed, are still considered by the FDA as ready to eat.
Yeah, you're right. So you're getting into now the definition of ready to eat that FDA, and that's a good point. So anything where there's a likelihood, as you said, of consumer to grab it and eat it without washing it or processing it in any way is considered by them ready to eat. So some of this produce doesn't even get washed before it goes to the store. You're absolutely right. And it would still be considered ready to eat, which is a risk exposure for us, right? Because ultimately, and I get into this more later in another slide, but consumers are doing a lot of things with their products that we didn't expect them to do. Things are changing. We're coming up with new innovative ideas. And bottom line is if somebody eats your product and gets sick, then it comes back to you, right? So that points to the importance, again, of what we're doing in the orchards and in the fields. So identifying preventive controls. This is something that we find gaps in. All right, so just as with some of the gaps we pointed out earlier, a lot of companies maybe still have their CCPs in their food safety plan, but haven't quite figured out or really wrapped their minds fully around what preventive controls they need to have documented in their program. In many cases, you guys are doing the right things already. They're already doing a lot of the right things to meet the regulation in terms of safety. It's just a matter now of documenting it the right way, right? So a lot of stories I've heard from the industry, people saying FDA came in and they didn't have any concerns about risk, right? We're doing swabbing, we're pasteurizing, or whatever it is. But they told us, hey, it's not documented as a preventive control and you need to get a little bit better documentation around the validation of it and things like this. So we're going to go through each type of preventive control at a high level just to kind of familiarize us all again and remind us, get a refresher on what each one is. And along the way, we'll talk about them a little bit in terms of where the gaps are. So process preventive controls are basically equivalent to CCPs, more or less. They're not exactly the same, but they're largely the same. Right, so any CCP is going to be a process preventive control. You'd be hard pressed to find an example of a process preventive control that isn't a CCP, but there might be a couple of them out there. Okay. So by and large, companies have their CCPs wrapped up. They have their process preventive controls wrapped up in a lot of companies that we visit. They've got defined monitoring processes. They've got corrective actions documented, verifications going on where people are checking with that second set of eyes. If anything, sometimes we miss the verification step. People just don't get around to reviewing a few of them, or they review it, but they don't sign it, that sort of thing. Or sometimes, as you see, it must be validated. Sometimes we see that companies haven't got a documented validation of their CCPs, although most of them do that I've seen. All right, so not as many gaps here, but I have heard some stories of inspectors saying, hey, you didn't document that this is a process preventive control. You just call it a CCP. Now, to me, that's just semantics. But if you want to be safe, right, if you want to make sure that question doesn't come up, one thing you can do is just define in your program. We have CCPs as part of our HACCP program, right? And we understand under the regulation that there's a requirement for process preventive controls. In our program, any CCP is considered a process preventive control. Then throughout your program now, whenever you have CCP listed, you've already defined it's a process preventive control. Does that make sense? I like to listen to different podcasts in the industry around food safety and things, and I've heard some other folks talk about this, and they made the same suggestion. Some of these industry experts are saying this too. We had David Atchison come to our conference last year. I think he said the same thing as well. So sanitation preventive controls. This is one that maybe some of you haven't thoroughly documented or identified. So we're talking about product contact surfaces primarily when it's a preventive control. Not always. It could be a drain. If there's a drain in a sensitive area where a product is ready to eat and you found listeria there before, that could still be a preventive control because of the risk. Make sense? Yeah, so two purposes though with sanitation preventive controls, as you can see. So pathogen control, right? So pathogens can be present on our equipment, so we got to keep it clean. We've got to limit the risk, minimize the risk of pathogens, right? Then the other issue is allergens, right? So this those two things, right? So if we have equipment that's shared, if we have crossover products, does anybody in here handle different types of allergens on the same equipment? Yeah? Does anybody want to volunteer some of the controls that you have or some of the things that you do between those products? To, yeah.
Well, we swap for specific allergens.
Great, so you swab for specific allergens. That's a common one for sure. You guys have visual inspection, of course, right? Some sort of document where you, so that's always the first tool you have, right? First tool, the most fundamental tool is it should be visually clean and it should be, you can use your nose too. Right, Tom? It's a classic tool for sanitation inspections is,
That's right.
if it looks clean but I smell something's off, I better figure out where that smell's coming from. There could be a problem, right? So visually clean and checking things with flashlights, right? To due diligence there and then swabbing. And the allergen swabs are a great tool for verifying that allergen has been removed in the short term. In the long term, getting a history of, the presence or absence of pathogens or the number of indicator organisms on equipment, right? There's different indicator organisms you can use, but things that are commonly around, like Enterobacter or aerobic plate count swabs, where you're looking at the numbers, and if you see a trend where all of a sudden, whoa, how come we peaked there? Why do we have so many of them? That gives you a good indicator that your equipment is clean or isn't clean. So developing that history is very important. In fact, I hope I didn't steal your thunder there at all. Tom's got an environmental monitoring section later that's going to be great. So allergen preventive controls. Here's another one that we missed the boat on sometimes, folks, is do you have a step in the process or a piece of equipment or a production line like we just described where we have a risk of allergen crossover? We should be applying the principles that we just discussed, the inspection, potentially allergen swabs. Now, some proteins, some allergens still don't have a specific swab for them, right? I've heard some of these things that maybe you can't really specifically swab for. So in that instance, there are some tools out there. You can get a very sensitive protein swab because allergens are a protein, right? You have a comment, Hector? And then ATP swabs are another common one, especially they have a sensitive ATP swab. They'll usually have two different types of products, and you can get the very sensitive one as an indicator of the cleanliness of the equipment. You have to be a little careful because ATP is not the allergen, and so you're not testing for the same thing, but if the ATP is very low, it's a good indicator the equipment is clean, so it's probably a safe bet, right? So sometimes processors will use a combination of these tools too, right? Sometimes to get what you want, to verify or confirm what you want, it's better to get the whole picture and use more than one tool. So preventing cross contact, right, is one of the types of allergen preventive controls. The other one is labeling. So cross contact in packaging and processing especially, but it can even happen in storage, can it? Right, so also equipment scheduling can be part of that formula. What do we schedule first, right? If we've got a product that has two unique allergens, we might want to run it last because we know after that product we have to what? Clean, exactly. Shut the line down and do a thorough deep cleaning, then we have to verify it. Right, so we might want to schedule that one last, right? So those are things that we do sometimes that kind of play into the whole, formula of how we control these allergens. And when we talk about labeling, generally we're talking about, in general, for any food product, it's got to be clear what's in the container. It's got to be accurate, right? If it's got something in the box that's not on the label, then that's a legal problem. It's mislabeling, right? But when it comes to allergen labeling and the consumer, anything in retail outlets ready to sell consumer direct should comply with the FAL-CPA regulations, the labeling regulations. Yes?
Yeah, I get into discussions kind of along those lines a lot because we manufacture food service products that aren't for retail.
Right.
But there's kind of a gray area there that there's not a whole lot of elaboration on by the government.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of kind of reliance upon retail guidance to help try and solve some of those gray areas, but it's not explicit. So therefore, where's the line?
Yeah. So in producing products, he said for food service, it's not going to retail. So there's not necessarily as clear a set of guidelines on the labeling. You don't have to comply with this FAL-CPA labeling, right? So I wouldn't be surprised in the future if they start to kind of pin that one down a little more, get more specific with it. But at the very minimum, you've still got to be clear on what's in the box, right? And what's in the ingredients. And then that way the kitchen or restaurant or whatever knows what they're purchasing, right? And a lot of these, have you guys seen this now? A lot of restaurants, you can go on their website or even on the little Ziosk at the restaurant, allergen info readily available, right? And it's because they rely on their suppliers like his company to be clear and consistent in terms of what's in the product, right? And then they can then pass on that information where we can hopefully, because food allergies are on the rise, and hopefully, in the future, if they continue to increase, people can still safely eat out without concern for their health. So
The hang up that we run into is a lot of our customers don't typically want either the name associated with the exterior packaging. They kind of want it as blank and clear as possible.
Yeah.
And they also have the ingredient statements that require
Oh, yeah.
the product specifications in order to kind of pass that up, so to speak. But ultimately, as processors, we're also not aware of what adulteration they're doing at the store.
Yeah, there's a lot there, right? I mean, that's a lot of issues in one question, right? Definitely. I mean, so what your customer asks you to put on the label, right, doesn't always include the ingredients because it's on the spec and they think that's good enough. And of course, as you say, after it leaves your facility, it could get contaminated. You're absolutely right. So supply chain, I want to get into this because supply chain preventive controls still need to be pinned down a little bit better, I think, too. And this is I think the last category here. And so what I did here on the slide is tried to kind of explain just in a single page summary what FDA's view is on controlling hazards in foods. Because ultimately, what are they concerned with? Food that consumers are eating is safe, right? So they want to see something somewhere in the supply chain to manage that risk. So as you can see there, you've got a food where you've identified a hazard. In this case, the example is salmonella, right? So 3 scenarios that FDA would look for. If the hazard is controlled by your supplier, they're pasteurizing it, something like this, then you have to confirm their process, their pasteurization step. So they're looking for a facility audit is required anytime they're doing the pasteurization for you and sending you a pasteurized treated product. You need to get an on-site audit from them. You need to make sure their process is validated, right? And then there may be other steps, like you might grab some samples and do some lab testing, or they might send you a C of A from their lab testing and you spot check once in a while, those sorts of things. For something where you're controlling it in your process, they would expect to see, and this is kind of familiar to all of us, that our process is validated, that we're sampling and testing as appropriate. We're monitoring the process to make sure that we follow the validation. And here's where it gets a little tricky. Now, I'm buying this product and I'm shipping it still raw. This gets into kind of the guarantee scenario that we talked about with growers. It's a similar structure. If it's controlled by my customer, I'm shipping them something raw, then I have to tell them, hey, this is untreated. So these are raw almonds for further processing. This is raw, whatever it is, right? This is untreated for pathogens or for microbes of, human health concern, right? And then they would then document back to me that they're going to control it, right? So it's the same scenario we talked about before. So some other recent lessons just quickly in preventive controls. Well, first off, this isn't necessarily a big one for the industry right now, but it has started to come up in some of the questions FDA or the state have been asking at facilities. Under the preventive controls rule, there's actually a little section that people are a little aware of about handling animal feed. We talk about this briefly in the preventive controls class, the PCQI class. But the expectations FDA has is that it be protected against contamination by an appropriate designed container. So we don't just pile this stuff up on the ground, right, and let flies and rodents get into it. It's in an appropriate container. It's not commingled with trash or any other contamination. And it's identified during storage, right? So we're looking for accurate labeling. All right, so then later we're looking for accurate, clear labeling as it's transported, as it's sold, moved around. The containers that we use should be examined for cleanliness prior to use to make sure we're not contaminating this stuff. And the animal feed rule is going to be enforced this year. So these guys are going to be under preventive controls for the largest animal feed companies, just like we are for human food. So that's going to start to, I think, maybe raise some questions as I start looking at the supply chain of these animal feed companies. So just keep in mind, this may start to come into view a little bit more, and you may start getting more questions on this one. Okay. Intended use and ready to eat. So I love this social media post here to the right side. I don't know if you guys have seen this or not. Said that she made some rare chicken tenders, and she said they were delicious. Now, this is a farce. I will tell you right now, it's fake. It's not real. I later found out. But then I saw an article that actually raw chicken is coming into vogue in other countries that they're buying from the US. So I don't know how they treat it. I hope they have some sort of validated treatment, but raw or at least rare chicken. But we have the example of gold medal flour, right? We've got the example of frozen foods where we run into issues with intended use and ready to eat foods, as you brought up earlier, sir. So, so ready to eat is, if it's intended to be eaten as is, or if it's reasonably likely that it could be eaten without further treatment. So I always bring up the gold medal flour scenario because we had this E. coli in gold medal flour, and we had some things happening like people getting sick from raw cookie dough. And everybody said, oh, it's the eggs, check the eggs. The eggs were fine. Wait, it's the flour? The flour has E. coli? We didn't think of that. The flour has E. coli. What, right? We had restaurants, and I think this is maybe going away a little bit now, but we had restaurants where they'd have pizza dough, and they let the kids play with this pizza dough before they eat. It's just fun stuff. Or maybe they make their own little pizza, and then they cook it, right? Well, the kids are handling this dough. It's got E. coli in it, and then later, they didn't wash up. And you know how kids eat. Their fingers are in their mouth, and these kids are getting sick from this stuff. Right, here's a raw agricultural commodity, wheat, coming in, getting ground up, and just nobody thought of the fact that it's probably got some pathogens in it because it's just raw, coming out of the field. Frozen foods. We know frozen foods can have listeria. They come out of the field too. The intended use of most frozen foods is cook it to 160, 165, right? Many of us, if you're throwing it in the microwave, the outside's hot, the middle's a little bit cool, let it sit, okay, let's eat, right? So people are getting sick from these frozen foods because they've got elevated levels of listeria. And come to find out, the plant wasn't doing its due diligence to prevent listeria contamination. But still, if it had been properly cooked, right? So our lesson as processors is these things get used for other uses than we intend them for. You know, cold brew coffee. People are making cold brew coffee overnight on their counters now. Coffee's pretty safe, right? But its intended use is hot water. Now they're using cold water on the counter. Who knows? Maybe somebody gets sick one day from that. I don't know. But we've got a lot of trends and innovation, social media ideas. Hey, try this, use that. 20 uses you never thought of for you know, shredded coconut or whatever, right? We see a lot of this now. So there's trends toward raw products. There's clean eating. Maybe you've heard of sprouted almonds. Some of you people are taking raw almonds. They're putting it in water, setting it on the counter for a day or two, and then eating them. Because the sprouting process, if it starts to grow, it produces these enzymes that are supposed to have a health benefit. And I can understand that, but almonds are known to have a risk factor for salmonella, and almonds are known to be food for salmonella. You add moisture to the scenario, we know salmonella is going to grow. So guess what? You're at risk, right? So we got to think about that. So we got this drive for new experiences, don't we? We got people trying to find new things that we've never had before. Now, records is a big one. I know I'm probably running a little bit late. Well, I'm just right on time here, so I need to get wrapped up here. But records, we see scenarios of inadequate records, missing records. We even see these in some of the warning letters with FDA where they say, hey, you didn't have adequate records to prove that your process was robust and that you eliminated these pathogens. Verification, a lot of records should be verified. Okay, so under FSMA, we should be having a second set of eyes on obviously our CCPs, our preventive controls, any of them. But also, is somebody reviewing the maintenance records? Is somebody reviewing the sanitation records? When you receive a report from your calibration vendor, does that just go in a folder or does somebody look at it? Because I've done a number of audits now in facilities where I start digging through the calibration records, come to find out a couple of devices were actually off and they had to be adjusted. They said, oh, we didn't see that. Why not? Well, we didn't look at it, right? So, I mean, and not to point fingers at anybody or make anybody feel bad, but these are just gaps in our programs that we need to be thinking about and get better at. Is any critical record like this should have a second set of eyes reviewing it, making sure everything's fine. Okay. Training records, of course, too, are important. So, and that's demonstrating that we're meeting all the training requirements. And it gets into the qualified individual requirement that's in every FSMA rule. So, and then testing and analysis. So we got the picture from our lab here, and you know, aflatoxin testing as a preventive control is an interesting one that came up in the almond industry. The FDA said, look, you're already doing this test for aflatoxin at the end of your process just to confirm your controls and make sure, right? But it's not indicated as a preventive control in your plan, so we think it should be. So that's a comment that came from industry. And then, of course, the importance of environmental monitoring can't be overstated. Keeping an eye on things. There was one that stands out to me that I put up there. Bluebell cookie supplier, right? So somebody was supplying the cookie dough for the raw cookie dough ice cream to Bluebell. There was listeria in it. They inspected the facility. Facility was filthy. There was so much cross contact with tools. But one of the things that stood out to me, guys, is FDA said, we found the strain, the outbreak strain, in your facility here, 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 and here. We found it living in your plant in multiple locations. Therefore, you have a resident strain of Listeria monocytogenes living in your plant. In a sense, it's kind of like pest control, right? If you had rats running around, boy, right? That'd be, well, you've got Listeria running around and it's out of control, right? So that's a lesson from industry as well. And then Listeria confirmation, I don't know if you're going to touch on that, Tom, you probably will, but FDA's guidance on Listeria, if you find Listeria, they're looking for you to confirm whether or not it's mono. Right, so, and then allergens, I love that picture. That's from an actual recall. Got this candied apple. It says plain caramel apple, but guess what's on it? Okay. The thing that stands out to me here is it's a clear package. They could have caught it. They could have avoided all the pain and suffering. Now, chances are nobody that's allergic to peanuts is going to eat that. So hopefully nobody was, you know, made sick in that. But that was an actual recall. And so just an extra robustness built into the program of checking things before they go out is necessary there. But allergens are still a leading cause of recall in terms of numbers of recalls. Maybe not in terms of cases of product, but numbers of recalls is still one of the leading, if not the leading, cause of recalls. And then finally, there's something that occurred over in England. There was a manslaughter conviction for somebody because someone died due to peanut in their food. And they had specifically written to the restaurant in their instructions or called them, said, I can't have this and this, make sure they're not in it. There was cross-contamination, or actually I think what it was is it was in the sauce they made actually had peanut in it, and they just ignored it. And so this gal died, and so it was a manslaughter conviction. So this just brings to light, we have a similar legal system here. And if if you don't, apply due diligence and do the right thing, it will come back to you. All right, so, and I don't think I have one more. I think that might be the last one for this section. Sorry, I went a little over. Listeria continues to be a big concern. Overseas, looking at things like the meat products in South Africa, there was the polony and some other ones as well, where just an unprecedented incidence of listeria causing people to get sick and to die. Frozen vegetables in Europe, they're finding listeria above their limits. Irish crab, listeria and Irish crab as well, where they had an emergency recall. Don't eat this. Don't eat this. It's got lots of listeria. We're really concerned. But interestingly, in Europe, they have a 100 CFU limit, whereas here, FDA seems to be saying no listeria should be present in our foods, no matter what it is. Right, Tom? Again, I don't mean to steal your thunder on your environmental monitoring section, but just really interesting. What? Australia also has a 100 CFU limit? Okay, interesting. So anyway, just some things to trigger some thoughts for you, some common gaps in the industry to be aware of. And so are we going to take a break now? So we'll take a break for 10 minutes, yeah? So come back at 15 after. Okay. All right, so welcome back, everyone, to the Bob and John Show. We're back from break. So we have a couple more subjects to go over today. All right, so we'll go ahead and jump into the next one, which is Sanitary Transportation Rule. So this will be a shorter one. And then, of course, Tom's going to cover the environmental monitoring, which is a big one in terms of importance. And FSMA, definitely has some elements related to that. And then finally, we'll cover the intentional adulteration rule at the end. All right, so we'll go ahead and jump into this rule. So compliance dates for the Sanitary Transportation Rule, just to kind of reiterate with everybody, the sweet spot has vanished. We're now under the compliance dates, or they've passed, right? So I guess I didn't word that very well, but basically we should all be complying with the sanitation of our vehicles, of our trailers, and all the other requirements under the Sanitary Transport Rule, regardless of size. Okay, so the scope of the regulation, now it's kind of interesting the way this one is laid out. So first off, it applies primarily to bulk or exposed foods or foods that are refrigerated for food safety reasons. So they're looking at things that are higher risk in the supply chain. Kind of like we were talking about a little bit earlier with the exposed tomatoes. That may be something that may fall into scope under this rule as FDA starts to regulate it more. But if you've got food packages that are sealed up, and I think of, crackers or cookies or something like that, where they're not refrigerated and they're sealed, they're considered lower risk and they don't fall under the scope of this rule as directly. Now, I still think those trucks need to be clean, don't they? They need to be pest-free and maintained. And so I think the minimum regulatory requirement still doesn't go far enough in some ways, right, as far as what we should be doing to protect ourselves and consumers. But there are 4 roles laid out in this regulation. And we'll talk about each of these roles and what each entity is responsible for. So we've got the role of the loader. This one's pretty self-explanatory. This is the one that's loading the truck, that's loading the goods, all right, before it's shipped. Then we've got the carrier. Now this is the entity, the company that is actually physically transporting the products in the trailer or in the train, whatever the case is. And then we've got the receiver, which is the company, the organization that's receiving the product, that's storing it. And then finally, the fourth entity, the one that kind of overarches all of them, is the shipper. The shipper is the entity that is causing all of this to happen. They're the ones that place the order for the product from the loader. They're the ones that ask the carrier to ship the product. They're the ones that are contracting the receiver, or they are the receiver. And that goes to an important point. Many companies will be more than one of these, right? So a logistics company may be the loader, the carrier, and the receiver in some cases. The shipper may be the receiver if it's a processing company. So you've got to determine, I guess, first off, how does this apply to me? Which of these entities am I? And then what are my responsibilities in that role? So who's covered? I think this is an important thing to note with any of these rules, right? So food transported in the United States by motor or rail vehicle, whether or not the food is offered for interstate commerce or sale. So typically, a lot of times FDA's purview is interstate commerce or food sold over outside of a certain minimum radius. This covers all food transport. Now, interestingly, it's by motor or rail vehicle. But I don't think there are too many planes that are dropping food off on your front porch. Now, of course, Amazon may get into that with drones, but prior to Amazon, somebody's still transporting it in a truck or a rail car. Yes?
So interesting, coming from Port Long Beach to Kingsburg, not regulated under this?
Well, it would be regulated if it's transported by truck or rail to Kingsburg. It would be regulated under this.
So it's like an imported food product?
Yeah, once
So-
it...
So this reference to interstate commerce, again, it's not.
It says whether or not it's sold for, through interstate commerce, right? So what they're saying is normally some of FDA's powers are, they're not enforced unless it's interstate or at least beyond a certain radius. In this case, that's not true. All food transport activity.
And I think it's because of the ports. We have product going to the ports and then out, so it technically never goes into another state. Now, where do farms fit into this?
Yeah, well, there's something with farms that we'll talk about on one of the coming slides. There is an exemption there. So, but you had a question? No? Oh, okay. So the final rule also applies to persons. So, for example, shippers, right, who ship food into the U.S. directly by rail or truck from Canada, from Mexico. This is covered, or even by ship or air for distribution and consumption in the U.S. So importers are covered. In terms of once the food gets here and starts being transported, it's covered. That makes sense, right? So those items are also covered. There are some exemptions now, so let's get into those. Covered foods, I'm sorry, but I know we have exemptions coming up soon. So covered foods, again, foods transported in bulk, such as juice, animal feed, things like this. So the fact that it's in bulk makes it more vulnerable, I think, right, to risk and to tampering or accidental contamination. Packaged foods that are not fully enclosed by a container. Now, in this one, I think of produce, right? We've probably all seen the produce boxes. They've got cutouts, they've got handles, they're exposed. So there's produce in this box, but it's not sealed in a package, right? So it's exposed. If I put that in a warehouse, there could be pest activity, something like that. So that's covered, right? You throw that on a truck and it could get contaminated. And then foods that require temperature control for safety, because they want to make sure that when it's transported, it's refrigerated or frozen. And that makes sense to me too, right? I mean, so as you look at this, it really is all based on risk, isn't it? Right? So it all kind of makes sense in terms of risk, not covered. So any operations less than $500,000 in annual revenue. So that's their small size cutoff. And I will say that with any of these fiscal cutoffs, under any of the FSMA rules, it is a 3-year rolling average for the past 3 years revenue. And it is adjusted for inflation. So they come out periodically with adjustments for inflation. So 500,000 becomes 508,000, $291 or whatever it is. Transportation activities that are performed by a farm, as Tom alluded to just a few minutes ago, there's an exemption there for those as well. So, you know, there are things that we should be doing as a farm in terms of making sure those trucks are clean, they're safe. But all of this regulatory structure doesn't get applied to a truck that's transporting, you know, on a farm or off of the farm directly somewhere. So if it's done by a farm, now that begs the question, what if it's FOB, right? Somebody arranges the truck, right? So my customer arranges the truck comes and picks up my product, and as soon as it's on the truck, it belongs to the customer. Now, in my mind, that would be covered then. That makes sense. So it's not transportation being done by a farm. Right. At that point, it's in the supply chain. So it needs to be done properly. Food not consumed in the U.S. So anything we're producing for, you know, for export, or foods that are trans-shipped, which I believe, yeah, that's not on this slide. It may be on another, but foods that are trans-shipped through the U.S., but they're not for sale here. This, for instance, driving from Mexico to Canada. So that wouldn't be covered under the rule because it's not for sale here in the U.S. All right, and again, foods that are fully enclosed or shelf stable. So some notable items, again, a company may fall under multiple categories, as I said earlier. There are some general responsibilities here that are applicable to everyone, which we'll talk about in a minute here, but there's some overarching responsibilities of all of us to report any issues and deal with them properly. And one other thing, if you have designated responsibilities, which typically this is going to be the shipper. The shipper has some responsibilities that they are able to contract out to one of the other three parties if they want to. And as long as that party agrees, then contractually they're obligated to do it. So, so I mentioned everyone's responsible for certain things. Okay, so anytime that food could be contaminated, it's our job to prevent that from happening, right? So we need to make sure that adequate temperature controls are in place, right? So that's anybody who is directly transporting food, storing food, or anybody who has the ability to have control over that while they're handling the product. They should be making sure temperature is correct. Preventing cross-contamination. We're talking about from raw to finished goods. We're talking about non-food items to food. Any kind of cross-contamination should be prevented, and food allergen cross-contact. That's also an important one. And then report any potentially unsafe food. There is a legal requirement for all of us in the supply chain. Anybody handling that product is now legally obligated if they observe something where a product could be at risk, if they unload it and it's too warm, if they are moving this product but it looks like it's been tampered with or it's got pest activity, it's your legal obligation now to make sure that appropriate corrective actions occur, right? That shouldn't be just shipped and out of our hands and we forget about it. That makes sense, right? A lot of things like this where we have no overarching rule under FSMA like this, yeah, it's maybe a little bit more than what we had in the past, but it seems like a no-brainer to me that we should all be responsible to make sure things are safe if we see a problem. So the shipper has the most responsibility. Just going briefly over each entity under the rule and what their responsibilities are. The shipper has to have procedures to ensure that the vehicles are sanitary, to ensure that the previous cargo doesn't affect the safety of the product. We talked about raw products or non-food items, right, or allergens, right? So the shipper has to make sure that that is occurring. And then temperature controls need to be followed, so the shipper needs to make sure that occurs. Now, again, the shipper is the one pulling the strings, right? They're not necessarily doing the transport. So what do they do then? As I just talked about, they then turn around and they put in a contract with somebody to say, hey, you need to maintain temperature on this, right? You need to make sure these trucks are clean before you load the product onto them. And then records demonstrating communication to carriers. So if I've communicated with carriers or somebody, hey, could you do this? Could you do that? I should have a document showing that. I should have an agreement, you know, with them and document that. I can't just say, oh yeah, that's their job, right? That should be documented. The loader, make sure the vehicle is clean. Make sure temperature controls are in place and the vehicle is in good repair. Pretty straightforward, right? If I'm loading something on the truck, make sure it's in good shape. The carrier, I should have SOPs in place for cleaning and inspection of vehicles or other relevant activities, depending on what I'm transporting, depending on what I'm doing, right? Whatever is relevant. So if I've got a, what do they call the trailers they put the tomatoes in again? The plastic dump trailers. There's a name for them, right? The gondolas, right? So the controls that I have in place for those gondolas are going to be a little bit different than something like a trailer, right? That's being hauled, that's enclosed, right? Because the product is touching the gondolas directly. So, you know, different scenarios, different types of controls with respect to the activity, right? And then employee training needs to happen with respect to those controls. So the truck needs to be cold, it needs to be clean, whatever it is. I should train my employees, right? But that's based on an agreement with the shipper again. So I may not be an expert in food safety, right? So I'm ABC Transportation Company. I don't know how to transport seafood, right? The shipper should tell me, this is seafood. You need to do A, B, C. And then you say, okay, I'll do it. And then you do it. Make sense? Okay. The compliance dates have not yet passed for anyone. That's coming up this July. So my general feeling in the industry is you guys have a lot of great things in place, but you're not ready yet as far as compliance with this rule. And so let's get into some of the details around what's required and explain why I say that, because I think a lot of companies will be surprised to find that they're not quite there yet. Okay, so for the largest companies, it's this July. So who's covered? So manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding of human food are the activities that are covered. So those are the same activities that are covered by preventive controls rule. So basically, if you register under Section 415 as a food processor, you're covered by it. It is not for farms. It's not for retail food establishments. So farms, of course, fall under produce safety rule, right? We discussed that. Retail food establishments are usually inspected by local health departments, right? So it's regulated differently. So it's domestic and imported foods, right? So again, we're talking about anything that's sold to people in the US, right? We want to make sure that what I buy off the shelf for my kids is safe, regardless of where it came from, right? We want equivalency. So that's what we're looking for here. So there are some exemptions or some modified requirements. The rule does establish requirements to try and, we've got this significantly minimized language again here, don't we? Right? But instead of significantly minimizing, say, a microbial hazard, it's minimizing acts intended to cause wide-scale impact, right? Tampering with the food supply, intended to cause a wide-scale impact, maybe terrorist activity or attempt to hurt the company, the food company, something like this, right? So, you know, these big incidents. So it does use a HACCP type approach, but it does have some important differences, and it's risk-based or intended to be risk-based and flexible. But when I say a HACCP type approach, right before we do our hazard analysis, what do we draw out? Flow diagram. They want to see a flow diagram. Can you believe that? Now we may be able to use our HACCP flow diagram. We may find that we need to customize it and change it because we're no longer talking about, okay, it's received, it's dumped, it's you know, roasted. Now we're talking about what could happen. Who could get in there and do something? So the flow diagram may need to look a little different. All right, so then from there, as far as elements of the plan are concerned, right, we need a vulnerability assessment. So with HACCP, we do our flow diagram, we do our hazard analysis based on the flow diagram, as well as our ingredients and such, right? Here, same thing, right? So we're looking for a diagram and we're looking for a vulnerability assessment based on that diagram. Now, FDA picks out some specific things, and we'll get into this a little bit later, that are more risky. Things like if you are grinding or milling something, right? There's a greater risk there of somebody easily putting something in and it gets ground up or milled up with it, that sort of thing. So what sort of activities or chopping or cutting that may be a little bit more risky that we need to think about as protecting them more, which gets back to our discussion of the red zone, so to speak, of that sensitive area for microbes and for tampering, right? So with that vulnerability assessment, you're going to pick out a few things that are those key vulnerabilities. So you're going to have a mitigation strategy for each of those. So what is my strategy to limit the potential of somebody throwing something in before it gets ground up, right? Or the filters can be used for physical hazards, whatever, but some sort of strategy to mitigate it from happening. Procedures for monitoring. So we got to do food defense monitoring of the facility. And I use the term food defense there because that's a common term in the industry, right? But monitoring the facility, we've got now, everybody has cameras, right? Most companies do if they're processing. We've got people, checking visitors in. But how good are your controls, right? If I walk around your facility right now and check the doors, will I be able to walk through? How far would I get before somebody stopped me, right? And we look under BRC and SQF programs, we see, these sorts of programs requiring that we check and verify the effectiveness of these programs. Same thing here, we have to verify the effectiveness. So a great way might be, why don't you do that tomorrow, right? After lunch, come back, walk around and check the doors and see if you can walk in, right? Or, maybe you can have, a friend or somebody, see how far they get through before somebody stops them and
Someone
asks them who they
sneak
are.
past the guard shack.
Now,
or
don't
something.
tell somebody to throw on a black mask and come in and scare people to
Right.
Dickens, right?
Yeah.
But what can you do to verify your programs in an easy way,
Right.
right? And that's what we're looking for. So what are your procedures for monitoring? What are your corrective actions if something goes wrong, right? What do you do to fix things? Whether it's related to we should limit people from getting in that way, we need to change something. Some of our products at risk, what do we do with our product, right? Corrective actions should address any of those things if they're an issue. How do we verify, like I just talked about? What records do you keep, right? Do we keep records if we have activities where we check the doors? If we have, checking in of visitors, do we have records of those activities, right? To make sure that we can demonstrate we're doing them. And then training of employees. Obviously, every one of these rules, every one of these systems we talk about, train, right? And don't do what we commonly see in none of your facilities, of course, right? But we see people that will, they'll train somebody and then you wait 5-10 years until they make a mistake and retrain them, right? We want to talk about these things on a regular basis, retrain at least every year, discuss these things, have tailgate meetings, right? We don't have to have an 8-hour training. In fact, I think that's less effective, don't you? Right? Okay, sit down in this room for 8 hours. You normally walk around all day, but sit down and stay awake.
Ugh.
And we're going to back up the dump truck and fill your brain with food safety. Yeah. Don't forget anything.
It doesn't work. Yeah.
Right? No, it just doesn't work.
No.
So let's have 5-minute tailgate meetings once a week.
Right.
And talk about hand washing, about cleanliness, right? About visitor controls.
To the
that sort of
point.
thing. So your assessment, what does that look like, right? Well, we need to identify the highest risk points or what they call actionable process steps. Right, so this is based on an assessment of several things for these process steps. So each process step, we look at what is the potential public health impact if something goes wrong at this step, right? What is the degree of physical access to the product at that processing step? How easy is it for someone to get in there? Which is why, again, we recommend enclosing certain areas of the plant that are higher risk, so there's a double barrier, even triple barrier to get there in the first place, right? And then the ability of the attacker to successfully contaminate it in the first place, which gets down to, would we detect them, right? Is it physically easy for them to get in there and put it in? If they do put it in, how likely are we to detect it afterward? Right. Detection afterward is an important factor too, isn't it? Right, so your assessment, you may want to add in some assessment of detectability afterward too, as you look at that third point. Okay. So just continued, we've got to consider the possibility not only of outside parties, but also inside attackers. What are we doing to prevent that? Now, you can only do so much, right? At a certain level, you really have to trust your employees, don't you? Right? You've got to trust your employees to do the right thing. But what are we doing around qualifying people before we hire them? What are we doing about managing situations if we suspect that a certain employee might be disgruntled? How do we manage that situation? How do we have those discussions with those employees, or, tell other employees, hey, see something, say something, right? Isn't that the phrase? That applies everywhere. Right. Food safety, food defense, everything, right? If somebody's at lunch talking about how I'm so mad, I wish I could just throw something in the vat, right? We should have that conversation with our employees. And if they overhear something like that, they need to tell someone, right? Which is, maybe something we're not thinking about right now. And we need to start thinking in those terms now. The outcome of the assessment must be written. They always say this in these presentations on these regulations, is it must be written. Well, to me, that's obvious, but people don't always write it down, right? Well, it's up here. I did it, right? I assessed it. So Key activity types are considered an appropriate method. And what this means is FDA identifies certain key activity types, as I said, like grinding or milling, chopping, activities like that, that they've identified as key activity types that at the very minimum, you should look through your process and say, do we have any of those? If we have any of those, that is a control point. You might look at it and say, well, we have one or two of those, but we also think we need to control this and this. That's fine, right? You can add your own controls as well, but at a minimum, you need to say, okay, any of those activities need to be controlled. So your mitigation strategies, these are measures that ensure significant vulnerabilities that actionable process steps are significantly minimized or prevented. Now, you can tell some of this language is from FDA, can't you? Right? They're very verbose, right? But sometimes the best way for me to present it is to take it from theirs and then explain it. So it's pretty straightforward though, right? We've got a measure that needs to be effective at mitigating whatever risk we've identified. There's a significant risk, an effective measure needs to be in place. Okay, so any actionable process step, remember that phrase, as we identify those, any of them, we need to have an implemented mitigation strategy. And we need to have a written explanation for how it affects the risk, how that strategy works. And as I think about HACCP, right, we have a step, we explain the control, and we justify why. So here we need to be justifying why we have that step and how it's effective. So some additional requirements that we have in place and documented monitoring procedures. So it's not enough just to have a mitigation strategy. We've got to monitor how effective it is, like we just kind of talked about in terms of facility security measures, right? So how do we monitor it? What corrective actions do we have in place? How do we verify things are effective? And then reanalysis. Now, how often would you reanalyze your food safety plan, do you think, to be safe? Annually? Every year?
Mm-hmm.
So I would think every year would be good. Under the preventive controls rule, a lot of folks don't know this, but it's every 3 years. Now under this, it's also every 3 years. So FDA, again, is setting a very low bar for us. Every 3 years, at least, we got to reassess this plan.
It's a minimum, yeah.
At minimum. I would say every year, because things change a lot. Employees,
Yeah.
you know, turnover, new equipment. So, but a minimum every 3 years. And then, of course, training. And then finally, we just want to throw out there, Safe Food California, again, April, coming up first week of April, the 1st through the 4th. It's going to be an excellent event. Telling you, if you want to come and get a tune-up and an update on all your food safety skills, we'll have folks there from BRC and plenty of other organizations, regulators. Atchison's going to be there. We're going to be talking about all kinds of topics. So check out the website, grab a card on your way out, and take a look because we'd love to have you there. And stay in touch. We'll be hanging around, but stay in touch if any of you have any questions. Our online audience, again, reach out if you have any follow-up questions or anything. But thank you very much for coming. And also one more thing, we'd love to get your feedback. We have feedback forms out there. If you want to fill one out, I forgot to have them pass them around, but if you want to, or just verbally share your feedback too, we'd love to get your feedback on how things went today.
Safe Food Academy, these are all the things we have online. Environmental monitoring, root cause analysis, internal auditor, HACCP 101.
So check out our web-based training too.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're very excited about this new thing, and we're going to continue to see it grow and add courses as we go forward. So
Just for this HACCP one, we're offering a $50 discount through the end of January.
great. So there's a $50 discount on the 2-day HACCP course. It's
Cool.
it's a recognized course by the International HACCP Alliance. Same materials we use for our 2-day course. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All signed in. Signed in.
Good stuff.